want to talk about the persistent inequality of LGBT people in Brazil that has been going on for decades now, and what was done and should be done to fight against it.
When we think of Brazil, we associate it with images of transvestites, carnival drag queens, and the boys of Ipanema, and allow ourselves to think that Brazil is a very gay-friendly place. In reality, it is and it isn't. Brazil is more tolerant of LGBT people than many other Latin American countries. You can see both gay and lesbian romances played out on nightly novelas, and there are openly gay and lesbian celebrities. Ultimately, many Brazilians don't mind if you identify as LGBT, but they don't want to be reminded of it. For example, they can deal with the fact of a same-sex romance in theory, but don't want to see signs of it. In the end, most LGBT people in Brazil experience consistent inequality. This is mainly based on prejudices and discrimination as well as racism. In studies, it was found that 90% of Brazilians believe that there is prejudice against LGBT people, although only 28% admitted to have discriminated against them. When we take a closer look at actual numbers, however, we can see that this discrimination is widely spread. Solely in 2011, 261 murders were associated with homophobic crimes. In 2012, numbers even increased by 27%. Additionally, it has been reported that more than 6,000 emergency phone calls were associated with human rights violations against LGBT people. It is therefore not surprising that Brazil has been identified as a worldwide hotspot of homophobic and transphobic crimes. These violations often are agglomerated in certain facets of the Brazilian society, especially in the educational system. This results in a reduced school attendance of LGBT people. In absolute terms, it was found that in 2 Brazilian cities, almost 50% of transvestites did not even finish elementary school, and around 80% leave their parental home before the age of 18 due to their gender identity and sexual orientation. Due to the inequality of educational opportunities, they often suffer from poverty and a reduced access to basic needs, such as financing, professional career opportunities, and more violence. Many Brazilians are not okay with this persistent inequality. For this reason, the Brazilian LGBT movement established as one of the oldest and largest politically engaged movements in Latin America. Starting in 1964, a community of young people acted nationally and internationally towards a generational shift in beliefs and values. This youth counterculture motivated student mobilization in the 60s and 70s and was also responsible for the rise of identity-based social movements, including the homosexual liberation movement calling for democratic and revolutionary change. It became known as the Tropicalismo. In the late 70s, the military coup announced a gradual democratic opening, known as the Abertura. The cultural and sexual contestation gained impulses and ultimately found expression within the partisan left, paving the way for its opening to homosexual liberation. At the beginning of the 1980s, the homosexual liberation movement in Brazil experienced depression due to the appearance of HIV/AIDS epidemic,
which shows that the lifestyle of some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer,
which led to the death of many activists and internal divisions of the homosexual movement. The homosexual population was initially seen as the most vulnerable group. The epidemic was therefore often described as gay cancer or gay plague. The movement reacted with internal divisions. Some wanted to fight against it, some preferred to hold back so that AIDS would not be identified as a homosexual disease. Violence against gays and transvestites increased. Some were convinced that AIDS was a direct consequence of the gay lifestyle. However, with the fall of the military dictatorship and the transition to democracy, there was also a reorientation of efforts among activists to fight the AIDS epidemic, change social prejudices, and finally deal with it publicly. In 1982, Brazil had its first legislative and gubernatorial elections since the dictatorship was installed, making a decisive moment in the political trajectory of the homosexual movement. As a result, an anti-discrimination plan was included in the first national program. So what does the Brazilian government do to alleviate this inequality? In general, the Brazilian government is more open-minded than many other countries in Latin America. Nevertheless, structural policies towards LGBTs in Brazil, except for specific areas such as sexual education, were not common. This might be based on the fact that sexuality is not considered to be a key dimension of social well-being in Brazil. However, in fact, it does, as identifying LGBT frequently impairs the ability of these individuals to access educational, economic, and social resources. Furthermore, Brazil's government does not yet recognize LGBTs as families for their structural policies. So what needs to be done to make everyone actually equal in Brazil's society? Firstly, homophobia and transphobia should be considered a structural matter. It clearly supported strategies needed against homophobia and sexism in educational policies in the national curriculum. There is a need to articulate and strengthen the intersectionality between educational policies against homophobia with other public policies, such as poverty reduction, work, health, and others. Long-term policies against homophobia should be developed. Resources are required to support staff and promote equality.